Okay, so now after examining some of the basic ideas in sociological thinking and exploring some of C. Wright Mill's main concepts around the sociological imagination, I'd like to kind of extend the analysis and further apply the sociological imagination to social conditions, social phenomenon. So the first one I'd like to discuss is vertical social mobility and how it can be analyzed using the sociological imagination. Vertical social mobility, you'll see, is highlighted here in red, just as a kind of best practice moving throughout the course material. Key terms will usually be highlighted in a color that stands out from the rest of the text. In this slide set, it is red. These terms will certainly be on the quiz and are key terms that you might use in other forms of assessment in the course. So getting back to the basic idea here, vertical social mobility is a term that refers to the likelihood of advancing up the social hierarchy. So when we're talking about vertical social mobility, often today we're talking about mobility within class systems of stratification, like the one we live in here in the United States, or really any other system of stratification that exists in the world, because class systems of stratification are germane to capitalist economic systems, and capitalism is pervasive, almost ubiquitous around the globe. Even nations that call themselves something other than capitalist tend to practice capitalism. So you can look at China or North Korea even, or places like Venezuela that use, or Cuba, that use kind of communism as a way of describing their political and economic systems, when in fact they are still participating in global capitalism to varying degrees. So we're looking here at vertical social mobility within class systems, and in a class system of stratification, your social position, your ranking, is determined often from birth by one's parents' earnings, or one's kind of family status. So we don't necessarily get to choose our social class. That doesn't mean we can't change our social class. I'll let you decide whether that's possible or not, maybe later in the course. But vertical social mobility implies at least that individuals are changing their position relative to the previous generation, or more specifically their parents' generation. So this often involves increased earnings. It could also involve decreased earnings. We're going to just kind of talk about upward vertical social mobility here, which involves increased earnings, and we'll leave downward vertical social mobility for another discussion. So here's an example of vertical social mobility. Someone who was born into the 25th percentile of the income distribution. So in the United States, those who are in the 25th percentile of the income distribution, are maybe relatively low on the social hierarchy. If this individual who is born into that position is able to increase their income and move into the 75th percentile, then of course that is an example of upward vertical social mobility. However that person achieved it is inconsequential, but we're just looking at the vertical social mobility here. So this individual could have gone and got a good degree and been able to find secure and well-paying employment. They could have won the lottery. They could have become Instagram famous, whatever it is, in order to increase their social position. They have achieved vertical social mobility. So, getting back to some of the previous material, looking at the kind of social phenomenon that are interesting and important to sociologists. So vertical social mobility is a social condition that is not randomly distributed. Rates of vertical social mobility vary, and they depend, of course, on the individual and on individual merit. As I like to say, very few people, maybe no one who is successful, is not trying hard. There are, it takes a lot of hard work to become successful, but not everyone who works very hard is financially successful or rewarded for their hard work. So there are other factors at play here, right? And often those who are lowest on the social hierarchy are, in fact, working the hardest. So vertical social mobility is not randomly distributed. It is correlated. Oh, excuse me. With aspects of our identity, which I'll refer to here as social background. You'll notice that social background is also in red, which means it's an important key term. These are examples of social background. So our skin color, race, social class, physical sex, gender, ability status, sexual orientation, religion, education, I'd say immigration status, cultural affiliation. All of these things are aspects of social background. They are the kind of factors that identify us as individuals and distinguish us as individuals within a given social context. So here's an example of how social background is related to vertical social mobility in India. Some of you may be aware that India is the world's largest democracy. It is a rapidly developing nation. But it's also a nation with deep religious, maybe ethno-religious divisions is a more accurate way of describing it. So of course there is a significant kind of historical context of religious discrimination in India. This is, dating back to even prior to the partition of India into India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh as well. After the exit of the British colonial administration. But today, India is still characterized by high levels of religious sectarianism and discrimination against religious minorities, namely Muslims. So, particularly under the current administration, the BJP, which has a kind of Hindu nationalist orientation, we have seen, or at least some evidence in the media and some data to support that, those media reports of increased discrimination against Muslims. Recently, there were some citizenship laws enacted that affected Muslims and Muslim immigrants in particular. But discrimination against Muslims is well documented in Indian society, and we do know that there's significant discrimination in employment. So Muslims have a very difficult time rising into leadership hierarchies in the civil service, in the military, and these are very important social institutions for social mobility in India. In fact, some of the best paying jobs and some of the most stable employment is going to be found in these public institutions. So discrimination against Muslims has significant impact on levels of social mobility for that population group, and probably contributes to higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment, and other kind of social problems that are more specific or more prevalent in Muslim populations in India. We can also look at social environment. So social environment refers to the kind of historical context, the social, the political, the economic context within which we exist, the way society is organized, as is described by this term social structure. So kind of more broadly, we know that rates of upward social mobility for individuals are related to the level of political corruption. So more specifically, states with high levels of political corruption, as gauged by the Corruption Perceptions Index. You can go look at the Corruption Perceptions Index if you're interested in, varying levels of corruption around the world. That states with high levels of political corruption tend to have lower rates of social mobility. Now, this is, multifaceted and has different kind of explanations. But we do know that political corruption tends to involve kind of political patronage networks, favoritism towards certain social groups at the expense of others, and that individuals who live in kind of societies with high levels of political corruption may find that it is quite difficult to achieve upward mobility without the right political connections. So often, in places with high levels of corruption, we find that those who are in top level leadership positions are not necessarily the most qualified, but they're the most connected. So when you have societies that are kind of rewarding personal connections and where the strength of social networks matters more than agency and merit and skill, then mobility tends to be lower. Okay, so next up here, pardon me, I want to look at another social condition social mobility as a social condition, but more specifically within, a kind of a context where we can make some fruitful comparisons. So we're looking at social mobility here in the OECD. The OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now we're seeing data for a variable called intergenerational earnings elasticity. So intergenerational earnings elasticity is measuring the difference in earnings from one generation to the next. Paradoxically, on this data set, having a lower intergenerational earnings elasticity score means that social mobility is actually greater. So we have Denmark here in the first position, the DNK. And so this data set suggests that Denmark offers more social mobility to its citizens than does, so we have Australia, Norway, Finland, Canada, Sweden, Germany, Spain, France, the US, Italy, and Great Britain. So in this data set, we see that Denmark has rates of social mobility that are significantly higher, meaning that it is much easier to move up the social hierarchy in Denmark than it is in France or the United States or Italy or Great Britain. So, OECD is an organization of relatively rich countries. This allows us to compare countries with relatively similar social structures. And what this data set suggests is that the US has pretty low social mobility, not as low as Italy or Great Britain, but those societies also have very different historical contexts. We talk about the American dream, I think much less. There's a discussion of the Italian dream or the British dream. These are societies with entrenched aristocracies, with kind of deep social divisions dating back, for much longer periods than the United States, which is a relatively new nation. So the question is then, why does the United States have less social mobility than other developed nations? What's going on there? Why is it so hard to move up the social hierarchy here in the United States compared to a place like Denmark? One explanation is that the United States has much higher levels of inequality. So, we know through Wilkinson's research, but also the research of other social scientists, that income inequality and vertical social mobility are at least correlated, and at best there could be a kind of causal relationship between these two. Now I say could be because I haven't seen definitive evidence of kind of a causal relationship between income inequality and vertical social mobility. It's tough to produce those causal relationships. It's tough to get enough data to do so, but there are plenty of studies that illustrate the correlation. And the correlation tends to be inverse, meaning that as income inequality goes up, vertical social mobility tends to go down. More unequal societies seem to offer less mobility to their citizens than more equal ones do. So I want to expand on that by looking at a statistical variable that we use to measure levels of inequality, and we're doing this by measuring the income distribution within a given nation state. So, we're looking at who earns, the most income, how much income are they able to capture as a proportion of the total income that's generated in a given society, and that will tell us about the level of income inequality. So the Gini index is a measure of income inequality, that ranges from, let's see here. So the Gini index, ranges from 0 to 1. Sorry about that drawing there. And both of these are kind of ideal ends of the spectrum, so to speak. So a Gini index or Gini coefficient of 0 is going to denote perfect equality. That would mean that every individual in society has the same income. So we would have a perfectly communist egalitarian society if we had a Gini index of 0. A Gini index of 1 implies total inequality. Now this would mean that one individual has all income and no one else in society has any income. Now, fortunately, at least this reality does not exist, and all nation states have a Gini index or Gini coefficient score somewhere between 0 and 1. So here you're seeing Gini scores for 4 nation states. I tried to pick nations that kind of give us a good idea of the range of Gini coefficients. So you see South Africa is listed here with a Gini index of 0.625. By the way, I'm using Gini index and Gini coefficients interchangeably. Those terms are essentially synonymous with one another. There are minor differences, but it's not important for the purposes of our analysis. So we see South Africa here with a Gini coefficient of 0.625, which is very high. In fact, the highest in the world normally, definitely for a large-scale nation state, and usually the highest, in absolute terms. We do sometimes see that Namibia and Zimbabwe, sometimes Lesotho, show very high Gini scores that are pretty close to South Africa, maybe even higher. But they all have kind of a similar historical context in common. White minority rule, colonialism, are kind of shared historical experiences between those nation states. Now you see the United States here with a Gini index of 0.46. That's in yellow to denote a kind of maybe moderate or relatively high for a developed nation level of income inequality, certainly much higher than Canada with a Gini of 0.321. And here we have Sweden, Sweden showing a 0.249, which is usually one of the lowest Gini scores in the world. You'll be doing a reading on Nordic states, and you'll kind of see how inequality plays out within those Nordic states. Here's one more visualization, or kind of another way of thinking about inequality. These are Gini coefficients mapped globally, and so we're seeing shading in relation to Gini index scores. This is, they have Spanish translation here, but we're looking at Gini coefficients from 2017. Most likely these are actually from various years, because not every nation reports Gini scores every year, and in fact some nations never report them. But we are seeing some shading in relation to levels of income inequality. So just to start here, we'll go with the highest level of inequality, which is this dark red. You do see that in South Africa. We do have, Namibia and Zimbabwe that's showing very, very high as well. But this seems to validate the previous data set, in that South Africa usually has the highest level of income inequality in the entire world. you do see this kind of darker red is prevalent in some South African and Central African states. We do see Latin America is, showing some high levels of income inequality. Brazil here is in the kind of orange. And Latin America tends to have, South America and Latin America tend to have higher levels of income inequality than do Europe, parts of Asia, and parts of North America. But next I'm looking here at the United States. So the US is in this kind of yellow category, which corresponds with a 0.40 to 0.45 Gini coefficient. It's a little less than the previous data set, which is not necessarily a statistically significant deviation. But this does allow us to compare the United States with other developed nations. So then I'm kind of looking over here at Western Europe, and I'm seeing that most of Western Europe is in the low income inequality category. Also Canada. You'll see that Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, other developed states here in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Europe tend to have much lower levels of income inequality than does the United States. So, in this way we can start to kind of assess why levels of social mobility, vertical social mobility, would be lower in the US than in other developed nations. And just to kind of tie this all together, going back to our original data set, looking at income inequality and social mobility in the OECD, I'm kind of demonstrating here the correlation that I was speaking about earlier. So on the x-axis, we have income inequality from low to high. On the y-axis, we have social mobility from the low to the high. And we're seeing here that there's a pretty strong correlation. So, the United States is here with high income inequality and is actually showing the lowest level of social mobility on this sample. Now, of course, previously we saw that social mobility was maybe a little bit lower in Italy and the United Kingdom. So these data sets shift. It depends on, which kind of data you're using. And this is most likely an aggregate data as opposed to just the OECD data. But regardless of some of those kind of changes, the U.S. is still showing, right, much higher income inequality and significantly lower social mobility than other developed nations. You're seeing Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, kind of high performing here, low inequality, high mobility. Canada, Germany, seems to offer much more social mobility to their citizens than does the United States. And, so just to kind of think about American society and some of the, kind of narratives that characterize, our understanding of our social context here. The American dream is a dream of upward mobility, right? It's doing, better than one's parents. It's improving your position through hard work. Unfortunately, the data suggests that it may be tougher to achieve that American dream physically in the United States than in maybe some of these other relatively rich countries. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to this lecture on the sociological imagination.